Tantor Audio presents The Language of the Dead, a World War II Mystery by Stephen Kelly. Narrated by Shaun Grindell. Part 1. A Witch's Death. 1. On a late July day in 1940, a butterfly, an Adonis blue, landed on a sprig of honeysuckle in a meadow above the village of Quimby, in Hampshire, and began to suck the blossom dry. Peter Wilkins noted the presence of the creature, but did not move. "I must," he thought. The words bloomed in his mind like wings opening. The boys were in the tree. Crows cawed from the branches of a dead sycamore further down Manscombe Hill. Peter gazed past the old tree toward the village. In the same moment, Will Blackwell moved up the hill from Quimby, along the ancient path that bordered the wood. The day was hot, the sun bright, and Will moved slowly under the weight of the pitchfork and scythe he rested on his right shoulder. He came to the old sycamore in which the crows roosted. For 2 weeks, the crows had been speaking to him, and the message he'd heard in their harsh cawing had troubled him. He knew the crows as carrion eaters, lickers of bones. As he passed beneath the tree, the crows dipped their heads in Will's direction and shot invective at his breast, like arrows. Up the hill, Peter moved, startled. The blue butterfly parted its wings and fled. David Wallace sat in the Fallen Diva, his hand around a pint of local bitter. 40 minutes earlier, he'd nipped out from the Nick for what he'd told his colleagues was an early supper. In fact, the detective sergeant had eaten nothing, but had downed 2 pints of ale in less than 15 minutes, and was now on a third. He'd done his drinking at a table in a corner and spoke to no one, to decrease the chance of someone recognizing him. He felt light in the head, certainly, though not what he would call drunk. It was time, though, that he returned to work. A young woman entered the pub and sat alone at a table near his, away from the window. The woman had pale skin, green eyes and auburn hair, and was nicely plump, busty. She wore a simple moss-green serge suit and black high heels. Wallace thought she might be waiting for someone. He watched her for a moment, from his hiding place in the corner. She threw glances about the room, nervously, he thought, as if she hoped she wasn't being conspicuous. She turned in Wallace's direction, and their eyes met. He smiled. She looked quickly away. He thought of approaching her, but decided against it. He'd been gone from the Nick too long already, and faced nearly a 15-minute walk back. He counted on the walk to sober him up a notch. The girl was attractive enough, but with the war nearly a year old now, Winchester was full of lonely women looking for a tumble. He rose and headed for the door. As he passed the woman's table, he caught her eye. To his surprise, she smiled. He touched the brim of his hat. He glanced at her left hand and was relieved to see that she wore no wedding band. He did not want to cuckold some poor sod in uniform. Now, though, he had to hurry. His drinking had begun to scare him recently, and he'd entertained glimpses of himself sinking to the bottom of a bottle. He stepped through the door, into a warm, clear evening, feeling pleasantly elevated. 20 minutes later, as he mounted the steps to the Nick, he assured himself that he was in perfect command of his senses. He headed for his desk, where he intended to spend the last few hours of his shift attending to paperwork. He believed he needn't worry overly much about anyone noticing his mild drunkenness, given that the only person who seemed able to unfailingly catch him out was Lamb, who had gone home for the day. In recent weeks, Wallace occasionally had detected in the Chief Inspector's expression toward him a strange combination of exasperation and empathy. He was convinced that Lamb knew. And yet, Lamb had said nothing, issued no advice, warnings, or ultimatums. In the end, Lamb's silence had spooked more than reassured Wallace. The phone on his desk rang, which made him jump. Calm yourself. He picked up the receiver. The voice on the line was that of Evers, the man on duty at the front desk. "Have a call here I think you should take, Sarge." Bloody hell. Wallace didn't want a call. He wanted to finish his paperwork and go home. He had a bottle of gin there. He planned to fall asleep listening to the wireless. "Put him through," Wallace said. "This is Constable Harris in Quimby," a voice said. "Go ahead, Harris." "Well, sir, it's complicated." Bloody hell. Here we go. "What do you mean, complicated, Harris?" "Well, sir, we have a body. A dead man." "Hold on a second," Wallace said. "Did you say Quimby?" "Yes, sir, Quimby. It's just west of—" "I know where it is, Harris, thank you. Hold the line while I scare up a pencil." Wallace found a pencil and a sheet of paper among the piles on his desk and tried to clear his head of rubbish. A dead man in Quimby. He must call Lamb, obviously, but would endeavour to get to the scene ahead of the Chief Inspector to take care of the preliminaries, so by the time Lamb arrived, everything would be in order. He sighed, and was disturbed to find that his breath smelled obviously of beer. "Go on, Harris," he said. "I'm listening." Slightly more than a mile east of Quimby, Emily Fordham pulled her bicycle off the road near the village of Lipscomb, in which she lived with her mother. She laid her bike in the lush grass at the side of the road, and found a comfortable place in which to sit and study Peter's sketch anew. She understood well enough from the sketch, and the photograph that Peter had enclosed with it, that Peter remained troubled by what had happened to Thomas the previous summer. Thomas's brief disappearance had upset them all, but that had been a year ago, and in any case, Thomas had returned. Peter knew that. But one could never tell with Peter, really. She studied the sketch for several minutes, but still could not divine what seemed to be its larger message. A spider devouring a butterfly. Was she supposed to understand its meaning? Frustrated, she folded the drawing and put it in her pocket. She would decide what to do about it later. She had to consider the idea that Peter might have sent her the sketch merely to get her attention. She knew that Peter loved her, in his way, though he didn't understand love. Couldn't understand how love was different from friendship. She would ask to see Lord Pembroke about the matter. He would know the best way in which to approach Peter. She didn't want to hurt Peter's feelings. For the past 5 mornings, she'd awakened feeling sick and gone to the loo to retch. Although she'd flushed it away, she worried that the smell had lingered and that her mother would detect it and divine the truth. She could not let her mother know that she was carrying Charles's baby. She had not yet even told Charles about the child. She didn't want to burden him with another worry. Instead, she prayed each day for his safe return from the skies. On some days, the Germans were forcing his squadron aloft 2 and even 3 times. She hated the Germans and their stupid war. And yet, Were it not for the war, she never would have met Charles.
She decided that she shouldn't worry overly much about Peter. Peter, and all he represented, had become fragments of her past.
She cared now only for the future, for Charles and the baby growing within her. 2. Detective Chief Inspector Thomas Lamb sat down with his wife, Marjorie, to a tea consisting of weak coffee, 2 poached eggs each, and dry toast. Although they had a half-full tin of marmalade in the larder, they were rationing it, one day with and one without. Today was a dry day. Lamb raised his coffee to his wife. "Cheers," he said, smiling. He had begun raising his cup and offering cheers at their evening meal 3 or 4 days earlier, as a kind of joke in defiance of the war's scarcities. Slightly more than 10 months had passed since the war had begun, and in that time nearly everything of any worth had shrunken and diminished. Food, laughter, comfort, security. But even as he said it, Lamb wondered if Marjorie was becoming tired of his little attempt at levity. Even irony had begun to wear a bit thin as the war dragged on. The too obvious joshing seemed to contain a whiff of defeat, of whistling in the dark. Marjorie raised her cup and smiled slightly. "Cheers," she said. Lamb had close-cropped brown hair that was graying prematurely at the temples, and a generous smile that softened a buried intensity that shone in his eyes. He wanted a fag, but long ago had stopped smoking at the table because the smoke bedeviled his wife. It drifted into her nostrils and made her sneeze, and into her eyes and made them water, and the smell of the bloody things permeated everything. Lamb reckoned he did not own a single tie, shirt, coat, or pair of trousers that did not reek of cigarettes. A week earlier, he'd decided that he would give the damn things up. They were ruining his lungs and threatening to send him to an early grave. As of yet, though, he'd had little success in quitting. He still smoked more than a packet a day, and that even as fags had become a matter of patriotism, one should not hoard boots, blankets, or food. All were needed on the front lines. The same was true of petrol. Now the government was making noise about bloody fags. Still and all, Lamb knew from his service in the First War the importance of cigarettes and liquor to front-line soldiers. Rum and fags allowed the average man to keep on despite the hellishness. 2 days earlier, he'd bought a tin of butterscotch drops and was attempting to train himself to pop one into his mouth each time he wanted a cigarette. Now, as he finished his coffee, he fished the tin from his pocket and denied himself what he really wanted. He unfolded the evening edition of the Hampshire Mail with slight trepidation. Evenings, he normally checked the day's turf results, except on those days when he felt certain that he'd lost. That morning, he'd put 2 pounds on a horse called Winter's Tale in the 4th race at Paulsgrove, in Portsmouth, and almost immediately a bad feeling about the bet had surged through him. Such instinctual feelings came to him now and again. He didn't know from where, and often too bloody late, he thought. He found that he couldn't quite bring himself to check the race results. He knew he'd lost. 2 bloody quid down the drain. He and Marjorie couldn't afford it. Not really. Although he didn't believe in luck, necessarily, he couldn't help feeling that his luck was running poorly at the moment. He turned, instead, to the usual spate of grim war news. Less than a month earlier, the Germans had defeated France and backed the British Expeditionary Force against the Channel at Dunkirk. Then the Germans had stopped. an uncharacteristic pause that had allowed the British to evacuate more than 300,000 men from France. Still, the British army was a broken one. Then, 3 weeks earlier, the Germans had begun bombing southern England almost daily. The reason for this bombardment was the planned German invasion of Britain from France. If the Germans could gain control of the skies above the Channel, they then would send men and arms across to invade, to crush Britain in the same way they'd crushed France and most of the rest of Western Europe. On 4 of the past 8 nights, the Luftwaffe had attacked the Blenheim aircraft factory, which made bombers and lay about 25 miles to the southeast, though without much success. Neither side had quite yet figured out how to effectively maneuver airplanes in the dark, and so the German bombers often missed the mark, and sometimes widely. Around the bomber factory, they'd seemed to have blown up as much farmland and pasture as legitimate targets of war. This was partly due to the fact that the German fighters, the Messerschmitts, which escorted and protected the stodgy bombers, lacked the fuel capacity to stick around for the show once the German armada hit Britain. So they would turn and leave the bombers exposed as sitting ducks to the much faster British fighters, the Spitfires and Hurricanes. Consequently, more than a few German bombers each night turned for home and dropped their payloads willy-nilly on all and sundry. The press had taken to calling this tipping and running. A month earlier, the Lamb's 18-year-old daughter, Vera, had taken a job in the village of Quimby as its only full-time air raid warden and civil defense employee. With the German bombers arriving daily, even the tiniest hamlets along the coast had begun to maintain some manner of full-time civil defense presence. Quimby lay along the route the German raiders normally followed across the Channel from France to the port city of Southampton, which also had become a principal German target. Lamb and Marjorie worried that the village could become a prime target on which frightened, failed, or merely confused German pilots might unload their payloads before scarpering back to France. Lamb closed the paper. He knew that Marjorie had read about the previous night's bombing in Bristol, and that the story likely had called up in her the same anxieties as it had in him. Even so, neither spoke of it. They'd already exhausted the subject of what they called Vera's decision. The telephone in the front hall rang. Lamb went into the hall and picked up the receiver. Lamb? It was Wallace. Got a body, Guff. An old man, past 70. Pretty brutal, sounds like. Someone ran a pitchfork through his neck. Where is it? Wallace hesitated a hitch. He knew about Vera Lamb's civil defense posting. Quimby. The body was found on a hill above the village. The news surprised Lamb. Here he'd been worried about stray Germans unloading their bombs on Quimby. He hadn't counted on a bloody maniac with a pitchfork roaming the place. Who called it in? Local Bobby. I've rung Harding and the doctor and rounded up Larkin, and I'm heading there now. Do we know the old man's name? William Blackwell, farmhand. The Bobby says he's pretty certain the pitchfork belonged to Blackwell himself. A farmer named Abbott had hired the old man to trim a hedgerow along the edge of his property. Blackwell lived with his niece in the village proper, apparently, and when he failed to show for his tea, the niece went looking for him and sought out Abbott, who took her to the hedge, where they found the old man. Abbott tried to remove the pitchfork from the old man's neck, after which the niece went to pieces. All right, David, we'll have to move the body out of there before it gets too bloody dark. I'll see you there in 40 minutes or so. There's something else, Gov. Whoever killed the old man also carved a cross into his forehead, then ran a scythe through his chest. Bleeding hell, Lamb thought. A cross? He asked. Was this man Blackwell religious, do we know? Not that I know, though, according to the bobby, some of the village considered him to be a witch. A witch? Yes, sir. So the bobby says. But aren't witches female? I don't know, sir. Maybe the old boy was one of these witches who used a pitchfork rather than a broom. As soon as he said it, Wallace realized that the joke had not come off as he'd hoped. He counseled himself not to overdo things. He believed that Lamb had not detected any hint of the fact that, less than an hour earlier, he'd been sitting in a pub feeling elevated. Lamb returned to the table. "I'm afraid I have to go out," he said to Marjorie. "Someone has killed an old man near Quimby." He emphasized the near. Years before, Marjorie had grown used to Lamb having to leave the house at odd hours. "What happened?" she asked. Lamb always tried to spare Marjorie the gory details of the murders he investigated. "The usual thing, I'm afraid," he said. "He probably quarreled with somebody." "All right," Marjorie said. "If you see Vera, give her my love, and try not to stay too late." She rose, kissed Lamb's cheek, then began to clear the dishes from the table. Lamb picked up the mail, grabbed his hat, and went to his aging black Wolseley, which he parked in the lane in front of the house. He was one of the few men of his rank who drove his own car. He preferred it that way. Driving himself allowed him more freedom of movement. A month earlier, though, his Wolseley had developed the habit of failing to start faithfully. Sometimes he had to give the bloody thing 7 or 8 cranks before it turned over. He wasn't sure what the problem was. He didn't understand motorcars. But he hadn't found the time to turn the thing in to be checked. In truth, he was afraid they'd take the old car from him, and he didn't want to lose it. He'd grown comfortable with it, despite its eccentricities. He understood that the entire business, becoming attached to a bloody car, was asinine. But there it was. He settled behind the wheel and lit a cigarette. Given that he was about to go look at an old man with a pitchfork rammed through his throat and a scythe in his chest, a butterscotch wouldn't do. And he decided that he'd had enough of his own cowardice. He opened the paper to the turf results, where he discovered that his instincts had failed him. Winter's Tale had won the 4th race at Paulsgrove. Rather than being 2 quid lighter, he was 4 richer. He pushed the starter, and the ancient Wolseley sputtered to life on the first try. He smiled slightly and thought, lucky indeed. 3. Lamb pulled the Wolseley to a stop in front of Will Blackwell's stone cottage in Quimby. Several other dark motor cars belonging to the Hampshire police were parked by the cottage, as was the large, dark blue Buick saloon that belonged to the police surgeon, Anthony Winston Sheed, and the van in which Blackwell's body would be transported to the hospital in Winchester. A dozen or so villagers milled in groups by the cottage, talking quietly. Lamb felt their gaze turn toward him as he emerged from his car. He knew Quimby to be a former mill town in which many of the older residents still looked upon the police as mere extensions of the mill owners, though the owners had abandoned the place more than 40 years earlier. He looked for Vera among the knots of people, but did not see her. A trio of small children, ragamuffins in torn clothing, sprinted past him, nearly bowling him over, then vanished in the twilight up a footpath near the small, centuries-old stone bridge that lay at the center of the village. The bridge conveyed Quimby's High Street across Mill's Run, which tumbled into the village from the top of Manscombe Hill. A bobby approached Lamb at a trot. "Inspector Lamb?" the man asked. He stopped and saluted. He was fit-looking and fresh-faced, not more than 20 or so. Prime cannon fodder, Lamb thought. He couldn't help it. The bobby's face was flush. "Constable Harris, sir. Sergeant Wallace asked me to meet you." Harris made a gesture in the direction of Blackwell's house. "This is the deceased's cottage, sir," he continued. "His niece, Lydia Blackwell, is inside. They've lived here together for many years. Miss Blackwell is rather taken out, I'm afraid, as she has seen the deceased's body. She is lying down at the moment, on the order of Mr. Winston Sheed, who looked in on her on his way to examine the deceased. Sergeant Wallace has instructed several uniformed constables to stand by the house and let no one in other than yourself and other officials of the law. He has asked me to guide you to the scene of the crime. I'm afraid it's up the hill a bit." He hesitated again, then said, "Unless, of course, you'd rather talk to Miss Blackwell first." Harris's brisk thoroughness impressed Lamb, though he found Harris's reference to Will Blackwell as the deceased irritating. He wondered if Harris always spoke as if he were giving evidence at an inquest. No, he said. "Lead on, please, Harris." Harris saluted again and gestured toward the path by the bridge. "Right this way, sir." As Lamb turned toward the hill, he heard Vera call him. "Dad!" He turned to see her approaching along the high street from the western end of the village, where she kept her daily vigil in the Quimby Parish Council Hall, watching for any sign of a German invasion. She was dressed in denim overalls and soft service cap the government issued to members of the local defense volunteers. A young man dressed in dark slacks and a bone-colored sweater kept pace with Vera. His right arm was missing from the elbow down, and the right sleeve of his shirt was pinned back at the shoulder. He appeared to be no more than 20. Lamb wondered if he had lost his arm at Dunkirk, though Dunkirk had only just happened. Vera embraced her father briefly and kissed his cheek. They hadn't seen each other in more than a week, when Vera had spent most of a Sunday with Marjorie, and Lamb at home in Winchester. "Hello, Vera," he said, smiling. He missed her presence around the house. Even so, he kept his tone businesslike, so as not to embarrass her. "Your mother sends her love?" Vera smiled back. "Love to mother," she said. She was a slender girl, with a youthful face, though Lamb had long believed that she possessed what people sometimes called an old soul, a seriousness of purpose and wisdom beyond her years. She had big, bright brown eyes, and smiled often, and was capable of great stubbornness in defense of ideas and people she respected or loved. She glanced towards Blackwell's cottage. "It's terrible what's happened," she said. "Yes," Lamb said. "Did you know him?" "Not really. I heard, though, that he was just a quiet old man." "He was a bit more than that," said the young man. He was slender and, Lamb thought, quite handsome, with luxuriant black hair that was a bit longer than normal, and dark eyes that seemed fired with emotion. "Dad, this is Arthur Lear," Vera said. "He and his father have a farm near the village." Vera smiled at Arthur Lear in a way that left Lamb feeling unsettled. Arthur extended his lone hand, his left, and smiled. "Pleased to meet you, sir," he said. "The pleasure's mine," Lamb said, shaking Arthur's hand. "Well, we should let you go, Dad," Vera said. "I'm sure you're busy, and we don't want to get in the way. We only heard an hour or so ago." Seeing her father had left Vera feeling more conflicted than she'd guessed it would. She might have come without Arthur, kept him a secret. She probably should have done. Her feelings about him had begun to change recently, and she'd begun to worry if she'd done the right thing in allowing herself to become so quickly involved with him. Well,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?